Dr. Giles Tillotson. We'll be talking about the significance of the 20th century architecture. Dr. Tillotson is the writer and lecturer of Indian history and architecture. He was previously the reader in history of art and the chair of the art and archaeology in South Asian art at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He is a fellow of and former director of the Royal Asiatic Society, London. He is now residing in India and doing work in India, research work and writing in India. And he has written books on modern architecture. So we thought that he would be a wonderful person to explain to you the significance of modern Indian architecture, especially of Delhi. Thank you. Giles?
Thank you, Professor Menon, and good afternoon, everybody. Could I have the house lights completely off, please? And I need somebody to sit there. So in about 45 minutes, Tillotson is going to take us on a walk around 6 spectacular post-independence buildings in the immediate vicinity. So between now and then, my purpose is to try and put those buildings in a slightly broader context by talking about talking more broadly about the development of architecture in 20th century Delhi. So I'm going to be looking at a number of phases of the development with a selection of buildings from different periods in the 20th century, partly with a view also to trying to connect the threads between the post-independence period and the late colonial period so that one sees that the modern era is indeed, as it were, a part of history. On the technological front, I should explain that most of my fieldwork for my studies of 20th century architecture was conducted in the 20th century, which is hence the slide projector, the carousel projector, which may be a very unfamiliar machine to some of you. I hope not to the guy who's sitting next to it. Herbert Baker, the architect of the buildings on the screen, the Secretariat buildings, reflecting on the place of New Delhi in the broad sweep of Indian history, declared, quote, "In 2,000 years, there must be an imperial Lutyens tradition in Indian architecture." The remark shows rather untypical generosity towards his colleague and sometime rival, acknowledging the younger architect's superior powers of design. Allowing for some exaggeration, the idea might have seemed plausible at the time in view of some of Delhi's then recent buildings. Because working alongside Lutyens and Baker, there are a number of assistants who at various times set up independent practices and won commissions to design major new buildings in the city, many of which reflect in some measure the influence of the Lutyens style. So there's a kind of coherence to Delhi as it was developing in the 1920s and 30s. These buildings include, for example, the Cathedral of the Redemption. I'm just going to say next, please. So the upper of the 2 buttons. Great, okay. The Cathedral of the Redemption, designed by Henry Mead in 1928, whose interlocking geometrical volumes are clearly inspired by Lutyens' treatment of massing. The success of this design, to my mind, rests on its lack of fuss. There is just so much embellishment as is required to articulate an entrance, no more, and no fear of plain surfaces. In this, it resembles the modern classical aesthetic of Lutyens. Slightly less successful, I think, is, next please, Henry Mead's design for the Church of the Sacred Heart, more centrally located and perhaps more familiar to many of you. Less successful because he hasn't got the same simplicity of massing. And it's quite interesting, if you look at the Med archive in the Centre of South Asian Studies in Cambridge, I was looking through the volume just about this time last year, actually, and the original design had a single tower at the front. It was a much more coherent design. And then a note in his hand on the back of one of his drawings says, the RCs demanded two towers. RCs, the Roman Catholics. If you think of, because of course it's the Roman Catholic Cathedral, if you think of Roman Catholic architecture in this country, which is predominantly, the prototype was established by the French, and the twin-towered west end of the church is a sort of standard colonial approach you see all over the country. And so he had to depart from the design, his preferred design, to satisfy the clients. Always a bad idea. More successful, though, is St. Martin's Garrison Church, next, designed by A.G. Shoesmith in the cantonment area in 1928 to 1930. It takes the process a step further, creating a remarkable abstracted form. When Shoesmith told Lutyens that he proposed to use only brick, Lutyens' advice to him was, go for the Roman wall. What he meant was to avoid the decorative Queen Anne revival ornament that was then so much in fashion back home in Britain. The detailing, where it exists at all, is sternly architectural, a reworking of the lines of classical mouldings, as Lutyens himself had done with consummate virtuosity, for example, at India Gate, designed in 1921. Closest to the style of the master, I think, is Jaipur House, next. Near India Gate, designed in 1936 by Charles Geoffrey Bloomfield, assisted by his younger brother Francis. It is so close to Lutyens, indeed, that it's often been wrongly attributed to Lutyens himself, or assumed to be by him. My attribution of this building to Bloomfield is based on a report in the Journal of the Indian Institute of Architects of 1938, where the design is clearly illustrated and attributed to the Bloomfield brothers. In 1938 was the year of its completion, and a sole surviving signed blueprint in the archives of the Jaipur City Palace, where I often work. The blocky massing of the main building, especially around the dome, is very reminiscent of Lutyens. The materials and colour scheme also signal a clear attempt to harmonise with the buildings of both Lutyens and Baker. The decorative screen, next, that surrounded the now sadly destroyed swimming pool in the garden is a free copy of a screen in the Mughal gardens behind Viceroy's house, which still exists. This screen and the pool, of course, were sadly swept away when the extension of the National Gallery of Modern Art was constructed on the garden of Jaipur House. Lutyens-style massing was carried forward by Walter George in buildings such as the Modern School, next please, of 1936, where a deep shade created by the overhanging chudja pays homage to the similar lighting effects in Viceroy's house. Lutyens, with a touch of Shoesmith perhaps, emerge again in St. Stephen's College, next, also designed by George in 1938. This is a sort of mini St. Martin's. Note again the high arched verandas and deep chudja over the upper corridor. So there was a definite sense of a school of Lutyens. We might observe that the followers made little attempt to imitate his use of Indian forms and details, apart from the chudja. Lutyens, any of you who've studied the design development of New Delhi will know this, that Lutyens was at first very reluctant to deploy chhatris and other Indian flourishes. He protested when the Viceroy, Lord Hardinge, pressed him to do so to lend the buildings a local resonance. There was a great deal of argument about this at the time, and the political view was that somehow giving the buildings an Indian style would be accommodating to Indian popular public opinion. Lutyens' view was that this was a sort of throwback to the Indo-Saracenic movement and was absolute nonsense, made a nonsense of architectural logic. He was determined to avoid what he dismissed as the mad riot of the tom-tom. But he eventually tried to assimilate Indian forms and make them his own. His followers appear to have been hesitant to follow his cue in this case. So perhaps in the case of the ecclesiastical buildings, we might suppose that Indian details were deemed less appropriate. In the case of Jaipur House, originally a palace for a Maharaja, it arose simply from the preference of the architect. And now I think also of the patron. It's rather curious, the shift that you see in design emanating from Jaipur, actually, that up until the reign of Man Singh II, the last ruling Maharaja, everybody in Jaipur assumed that Jaipur was the fountainhead of design. People went there to learn how to design, and people like Swinton Jacob were exporting design to other parts of India. And suddenly you get this flip under Man Singh where Jaipur design suddenly looks frightfully passé, and what he's trying to do actually is to employ international architects, foreign architects, to design in the newest metropolitan or international, or in this case, imperial style. So Jaipur House does not represent Jaipur in New Delhi, which it ought to have done. It's a reflection of New Delhi itself, reflecting it back on itself. What Bloomfield, like others, learned from observing the work of Lutyens was less then about Indianization, more about massing, colour, light, and restraint in detailing. There was a Delhi Lutyen school, but not the general and lasting tradition imagined by Baker. There could not be, because these works were outnumbered by those of the Delhi Works Department under Robert Torr Russell, who adopted a more traditional and prosaic neoclassical style, next, in such conspicuous buildings, next please, sorry, that was meant to illustrate the point about Lutyens, obviously. So, next. The East and West Courts, these are the works of the PWD under Robert Torr Russell. The East and West Courts of 1922. Next, the official residence of the Commander-in-Chief of 1930, later used by Jawaharlal Nehru, of course, as his official residence, and now Teen Murti Bhavan, and most well-known next, Connaught Circus of 1931. After independence, the Delhi Public Works Department seemed more eager to look back to Lutyens for inspiration, as, for example, in, next, the Supreme Court, designed by G.P. Dialalika in 1955, and, if more remotely, in later new ministry buildings flanking Rajpath. But there were also touches of historicism, as in E.B. Doctor's Ashoka Hotel of 1956, next, where ornamental stonework in imitation of Mughal architecture seems to evoke something of the manner of the Indo-Saracenic movement of 50 years before. And sacred architecture in the city kept to its own quite separate track, updated in terms of material, but rigidly archaic in its imagery, as in, next, the Lakshmi Narayan or Birla Temple of 1956. And then came Chandigarh. Next. To be fair, I think the impact of Chandigarh is sometimes exaggerated. The international modern movement had certainly made forays earlier into India, most notably in Bombay, in the work of practices like Batley and King. Strange, because Claude Batley was much more historical in his approach to architectural education, but a modernist in his practice. There is also the justly famous Golconde by Antonin Raymond in Pondicherry of 1936, and some other scattered examples, quite often rather elite buildings like the Manik Bagh in Indore by Eckhart Muthesius of 1933. But Chandigarh is important, and because of the scale. It made a huge impact. The practice on Indian soil of Le Corbusier, the modern movement's leading and most charismatic exponent, had a profound impact on a whole generation of Indian architects. It made them look at architecture in new ways. Now, this is a story that you can tell in almost any part of India, but obviously I'm going to focus on telling it in Delhi. So in Delhi, one might cite as examples, particularly close to Le Corbusier's aesthetic, works by Shivnath Prasad, such as, next, the Akbar Hotel, originally a hotel, now a building of the Ministry of External Affairs, and partly also now a university, but designed originally as a hotel. In Chanakyapuri in 1965, the Sri Ram Arts Centre, next, at Mandi House, of 1966. I mean, I'm assuming to an audience of young architects, the Le Corbusian elements of these are sort of glaringly obvious. You know, the use of the Breton brute concrete, the very heavy forms and so on, are obviously straight out of the visual vocabulary of Le Corbusier. And Tibet House, next, of 1974 on Lodi Road. In a way, this building, it tells a sort of compressed history of post-colonial architecture on one site. When I was teaching at SOAS, Professor Mena mentioned that I was at SOAS for a while in the 1990s. A research student conducted research on Tibetan Buddhist architecture in diaspora. She looked at how the Tibetan Buddhists built mostly temples and monasteries outside of Tibet, and indeed outside of India in Europe. And what she found was that in the early years, in the 50s and 60s, and particularly in Europe, the tendency was to build an entirely modern idiom. And it was only the next generation who suddenly became nostalgic, and that there was then a return, an attempt to do a kind of revivalist Tibetan style. So this, or despite its late date of 1974, is an example of the sort of the first phase of that. You know, this is supposed to be a diplomatic representation building for the Dalai Lama, for the Tibetan community, in the kind of cultural hub of New Delhi, which is where we are. It's just down the road. And so initially it's built in this kind of Le Corbusian mode. And then 20 years later, everybody thinks, this doesn't really look Tibetan at all. I mean, how is this Tibet house? And so the coat of purple and gold paint added to the surface was designed to kind of Tibetify it. So you see two different phases of architectural ideology in a single building in this case. Among the other successful examples, going back to Le Corbusian pastiche, one might cite the Intercontinental, now the Oberoi Hotel by Durga Pajpai and Pilu Modi of 1958, the Civic Centre by Kuldeep Singh of 1965, and rather less successful to my mind, the Interstate Bus Terminus by Rajinder Kumar of 1969, and Nehru Place by Ratan Singh as late as 1980. There are many, many, many examples of such buildings throughout New Delhi. But rather than just give you a whole catalogue of Le Corbusian pastiche, I ought to point out that he was not alone. The work of Louis Kahn in Ahmedabad had a comparable impact. So, next. Sorry, that's the detail of Tibet House before it got its facelift. Next. This is the extension to Modern School by Jasmir and Rosemary Sachdev of 1975. And when it was built, it was hailed as a skillful reworking of Walter George's original idiom. But one could be forgiven for mistaking a view of the building for a picture of Louis Kahn's Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, next, of 1962 to 70, with its scooped out circles and exposed brickwork. Again, it's very much kind of response to a visual idiom of the master. Brick is an old and respectable material. It is not in itself modernist. But in the Indian context, brick had not hitherto been seen as elite. When used in great public buildings in the past, brick was usually concealed behind a facing of another material, such as dressed stone. Louis Kahn, famously obsessed with bricks, showed how it could be used for prestigious buildings, and architects in Delhi took his cue, applying it in all sorts of educational and institutional buildings. Among them, again, the many, many examples one might cite, I've chosen just three. Next. St. Thomas's Church by Oscar Pereira of 1971. Next. The original hostels of JNU, designed by C.P. Kukreja in the first half of the decade of the 1970s. And I would also include in this category, next, the Belgian Embassy by Satish Gujral of 1983, though I concede that there are other factors involved in this very, very remarkable design. It is Kahnian in one dimension, but it has other things going on there too. By the early 1980s, when the Belgian Embassy was built, some architects were beginning to question whether the hitherto unquestioned imitation of the masters of the international modern movement, they woke up to the point that their imitation of major works by Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn was largely a matter of appearances, of copying or adapting the master's visual mannerisms, rather than fully assimilating the logic and philosophy of modern design. To be sure, some of them had adopted the rhetoric of modernism in their writings too, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. But in their designs, the adherence to modernism was sometimes forced or superficial. The previously proclaimed universal applicability of modernism was being questioned now, even in the West, throughout the world indeed, but in the West which had nurtured it. how much more urgent it now seemed in the 1980s to challenge this in a country like India, which had a different developmental path. So the question that became so pressing in the 1980s and 90s was how to move Indian architecture ahead, keeping a hold on the technological and other material benefits of the international modern movement, while at the same time trying to restore something of the broken thread of a distinctively Indian tradition. I must emphasize, whenever anybody talks about this period, I think it was a very exciting phase in Indian design in the 1980s. Restoring the thread was not about archaism or atavism. The new quest was not a leap backwards into the past. There was nobody saying, look, we have to sort of erase the whole history of modern and colonial architecture and let's all live in replicas of the Kandariya Mahadev temple. That just was not on the agenda at all. It was assumed that the benefits, technological, sociological benefits of the modern movement were here to stay, but that somehow they had to be connected with a distinctively Indian idiom, that there could be such a thing as Indian modernism rather than international modernism transplanted onto Indian soil. It was about trying to find a way to be both recognizably Indian and modern at once. But where could you look to see how that might be done? How is it going to work visually, if indeed the visual is the domain that it's going to work in? Who were the exemplars who could show the way down that difficult track? Was there anyone after independence who had accomplished or even attempted such a task before? Well, yes, there was. There was Joseph Allen Stein in Delhi, an architect of Californian origin who had long been settled in India. He originally came, actually, can you have the next slide, please? So we're looking at a Stein building. Stein was one of those professionals who came to India, as it were, in the wake of the disappearance of British professionals to sort of fill a void. In most cases on a temporary basis, but in his case, he stayed for the rest of his life, working often with Indian colleagues, sometimes alone. And obviously he's very well known, his works are very well known to anyone sitting in this part of Delhi. Just among those that I wanted to pick out, one of my favorites, the Triveni Kala Sangam on the screen of 1957, which is an arts centre at Mandi House. This is the street front of Triveni Kala Sangam. Secondly, next, the building adjacent to where we are, the original hub of the India International Centre, designed in 1959. And next door, one of the buildings that Tillotson was going to show us, the Ford Foundation of 1966. So in this cluster of buildings, the use of stone, of coloured tiles, of cooling devices such as the jali, the integration, I think, particularly of garden and building, all point to his sensitive reading and reinterpretation of aspects of the Indian tradition. I think that these buildings are far from being historical pastiche. Their visual idiom is modern. And that marks a point of departure, in a sense. That marks a difference from the way in which some of his Indian contemporaries were looking at modernism and interpreting it as a visual language. He was trying to look historically and very much aware of the links. Why are we here, for example? We're here because he was asked by Jawaharlal Nehru to re-landscape Lady Willingdon Park, which you know as the Lodi Gardens. And he says, well, he will do this provided that the other project that Nehru wanted him to do, which was to design the India International Centre, should be contiguous with the Lodi Gardens. And so he's thinking at the same time of landscape around 15th century monuments and mid-20th century buildings cheek by jowl. His sometime partner on these projects, Habib Rahman, produced comparable works independently, such as, next, Rabindra Bhavan of 1959. Highly regarded, as well as personally liked within the profession, Joseph Allen Stein and Habib Rahman showed a way, and soon every architect and critic was talking about Indian identity and the historical thread. I mean, it was a very, very, very remarkable change. I did my very early fieldwork on a historical topic in the early 1980s, came back in the middle of the 1980s, as it were, to do another historical topic, and the whole language of architectural debate in a matter of a few years had changed. Every single journal, every single article in every single journal was called something like the relevance of roots and tradition, you know, the reuses of the past and so on. And it was a sort of craze almost that nobody could design anything without producing a justification for it that was based in history. And it wasn't just the architects who were involved in this. Eminent historians like Romila Thapa were sought out and asked to give their endorsements, certificates on the authenticity of the traditional qualities of contemporary design. It was all very heady days. One of the most articulate voices on this topic was that of the late Charles Correa. And although his practice was based in Bombay, of course, he left his mark on Delhi next, and may provide a useful place to start. Correa's engagement with Delhi is in truth a bit of a puzzling mixture. He was responsible for the planning of the Crafts Museum at Pragati Maidan, first laid out in 1975, a project that put him in touch with India's unblemished rural traditions. And a lot of people thought that this is the way to go. This was the area to look at. If you wanted to find an authentic Indian tradition which had escaped, as it were, the impact of colonialism and modernism, where better to look than rural India? I mean, there was this sort of perhaps rather mistaken or romantic idea that somehow rural India would remain untouched, had remained unchanged, and that the vernacular architecture, therefore, contained lessons to learn. So many others thought that. But if Charles Correa thought that, it didn't appear to have had much impact on him when he designed next the LIC building in Connaught Place, first commissioned in the late 1970s and built in the early 1980s. And I'm intrigued that you've used this as the icon of the day, because with its mirror glass and space frame, it apes the fashionable gimmicks of contemporary architecture in the West of the period of the early 1980s. And I have to say, it was greeted with dismay by students of Delhi's architecture schools at the time, who felt somehow personally let down by this maestro who spoke so eloquently of India's proud traditions. Charles Correa at the time was organizing exhibitions like Vistara, where he was trying to make connections between modern design and ancient stepwells, and it was all kind of wonderfully unhistorical. You know, you've got the whole of Indian architecture in a kind of single rush, a kind of, you know, whoosh of essentialized forms, which somehow, you know, all congealed into a single whole. And it was a very, very inviting thing to believe. And then he designs this, and you think, hang on a minute, what happened to the whoosh? The critic Hasanuddin Khan, one of the, again, a brilliant writer of the period on contemporary design across not just India, but the Middle East as well, tried to redeem this building by describing the building's two main blocks as forming a giant darwaza, linking Connaught Place to the rest of Delhi. This was a standard technique. You use a Hindi word to describe something, and it looks Indian. So the building is a darwaza. Nobody believed him, certainly not the armed guard who prevents members of the public from using the building as a route. You can't actually walk through this building as a normal member of the public, nor the planners who scrapped the required pedestrian bridge. If you've ever tried to cross the road at that point, you'll realize how, you know, you take your life in your hands. Correa had designed a footbridge to go over to link to the Central Park, but the planners wouldn't allow him to do it. Hasanuddin's comment, written in 1987, is chiefly significant as an indication of how desperate everyone had become to find a historical antecedent for each and every design. Correa fared much better, I think, with his building for the British Council next, of 1992, on Barakamba Road, on Kasturba Gandhi Marg. No doubt the cutaway facade still retains a Le Corbusian feel, is softened by the mural of a banyan tree by the British artist Howard Hodgkin. But the courtyard at the rear, next, is a more satisfying reworking of Indian spaces and motifs, with a particularly satisfying play of light. The warm red sandstone cladding, despite the baldness of the unmolded openings, states a claim of lineage through Lutyens back to the Moguls. The other non-Delhiite genius of that generation, B.V. Doshi, now Pritzker Prize-winning B.V. Doshi, has also left his mark on Delhi, though thankfully not through his earliest projects. Next. You all know the trajectory of B.V. Doshi, or if you didn't know it before, you've been reminded of it now because from all the documentaries about him on Facebook as a result of him being awarded the Pritzker Prize. Having worked in Le Corbusier's office in Paris as a young man, I mean, imagine the boldness of that. Actually, he simply goes to Paris and knocks on the door. And Le Corbusier says, "Your desk is over there, young man, get on with it." So Doshi contracted a particularly virulent strain of Corbusitis. And this is, of course, he's sort of reinfected when Le Corbusier comes to India, and he's able to work with him here, both in Chandigarh and more particularly in Ahmedabad. So the graceful city of Ahmedabad is sadly disfigured by such monstrous exercises in the Corbusian brutalist style as the Tagore Memorial Theatre of 1962, now on the screen. In 1965, Doshi described architecture as, quote, an art which organizes, coordinates, and orders life by its function of providing enclosure so that human beings may lead a wholesome existence. I've quoted that remark once or twice before, pointing out that it's a particularly spine-chilling example of the moralizing and social determinism of modern movement rhetoric, when I said that some of the architects of the time in this early phase adopted, if not the philosophy or the full ideology of the modern movement, nevertheless adopted some of its rhetoric. And there is a very good example about the only acceptable word in the sentence is art. But otherwise, what he's describing is architecture as something which coerces you into leading a healthy life. Nobody today wants to be taught how to live by their built environment, or even indeed by their architect. Certainly not the students of the National Institute of Technology. Next, please. This is NIFT, the NIFT campus in New Delhi, designed by Doshi in 1994. So by the time Doshi comes to design NIFT, his obsession with the shibboleths and the forms of modernism was beginning to subside. The building is marked by an interest in a variety of surface textures, no longer just rough concrete, and centers around a sunken garden, which you see slightly in the foreground of this, but next, please. No, actually, no, sorry, that's the outer courtyard here. That is made in the form of an ancient stepwell. So he's actually picking up something that of course, Charles Corrier had used famously in Johar Kala Kendra in Jaipur in 1986, redone in a slightly different form here by Doshi in the mid-1990s. It is a shame that this space is not more popular with the students. If any of you have ever been to NIFT, you'll find that it's a rather neglected, it's a visually stunning centerpiece to the campus, this stepwell. But the students, perhaps fearful of falling and breaking their ankles, prefer to congregate on the Institute's front steps on the main road. But this neglected garden is a genuine gesture of respect for a past that Doshi was once so eager to escape. Do not be fooled by the name of his foundation. I mean, the engagement with tradition in most of Doshi's designs, I think, remains at the verbal level, at the sort of Sanskritic label. Meanwhile, Delhi's resident architects, I've talked about Corrier and Doshi, let's talk about some of the residents, were pursuing similar lines. So, a few each. Achyut Kanvinde's National Science Centre, next, of 1985, also on Pragati Maidan, has Chhatri-like turrets and a Steinian approach to integrating plants, not particularly visible in this image, a little bit at the top there, but I mean, it's a wonderful kind of integration of the sort of sense of a hanging garden. C.P. Kukreja put away his stack of Louis Carnian bricks and reminded us in Amberdeep of 1990, next, that it is possible to cover the exterior of a building in coloured mosaic tiles and geometric patterns. This building is in a very sad condition now. This photograph was taken soon after it was completed, and it was, at that point, a really spectacular building, not least because it marks a complete volte-face from all of the modernist rhetoric about the iniquity of ornament. You know, ornament is crime. Take that. I mean, it was an astonishing building to look at when it first emerged. It's a sort of sultanate tower for our times. It looks like something that's come out of Bida, you know, in the Deccan. Remy Kozler, next, in his very graceful design for a school for the Spastic Society of 1993, seems to be reaching even further back than the Sultanate Deccan, playing with lines of ancient rock-cut chaitya halls. So if you look at the beyond the round tower to the section in the middle, in fact, I've got a detail of that next. So it's the sort of the profile of a chaitya hall reinterpreted as the opening in this facade. But the most overt use of a culturally rooted visual imagery is next. The Baha'i house of worship, popularly called the Lotus Temple, designed actually not by an Indian architect at all, but by the Iranian architect Fariburz Sabah in the early 1980s. But, I mean, and this in a sense is the most literal, apart from the, to international eyes, the slightly unfortunate resemblance to the Sydney Opera House. The intention obviously is to evoke the idea of the lotus, hence the nickname. And it's perhaps the most bold and overt use of an organic imagery to move away from the idea of a sort of uncommunicative functionalism of the modern movement. But I want to end with a handful of representative examples from the city's still, I think, most prestigious architectural practice, that of Raj Rewal. One of his best-known early projects, I have to, of course, mention in passing, but it's because of Raj Rewal that we're here, in the sense that it's because of the demolition of the Hall of Nations at Pragati Maidan that we were sort of waking up to the importance of preserving 20th century architecture. So let's look at some of the other things that he did that, you know, we hope we will not knock down. The Asian Games Village of 1982, next. Inside Siri Fort. The yellow reconstituted stone cladding, the complex rectilinear geometry, and the close-knit pedestrianized planning all consciously evoke the pattern of traditional Rajasthani towns like Jaipur and Jaisalmer. A footnote here. The dismal economic outlook in pre-liberalization in India meant that there were not very many large-scale private commissions to be won, or indeed not even, I mean, there were a few public ones like this, but not many private ones. And many talented and thoughtful architects took up teaching posts to earn a living. And because there were no live projects to study, they took their students to Rajasthan to map the forts and consider the spaces of traditional streets. So besides Raj Rewal, one might particularly mention in this context the Ahmedabad architect Kulbhushan Jain, and here in Delhi, Professor Menon. All did this, and the result has been a great boon to the conservation and heritage movement, I have to say. But things that were learnt in Rajasthan have, in some cases, also played back into the architect's designs, especially, I think, in the case of Raj Rewal. Next. Of course, it's partly a matter of perception. So a decade after the Asian Games Village was completed, I'm talking now about the early 1990s, Philly Desai, who was a student of mine at SOAS, wanted to test. I had been, amongst others, extolling this as this sort of brilliant reworking of traditional design principles in a modernist housing estate. And Philly Desai wanted to put this thesis to the test. So he went and interviewed the people privileged enough to live in it after, of course, it was built for athletes during the Asian Games, but subsequently sold. So he went to interview the residents and asked them their views on its traditional use of Indian planning principles. He said, you know, do you like living here? Did you choose it because of its traditional attributes? And they all looked at him in astonishment and said, nonsense, it's not Indian at all, it's modern. For one thing, it's clean. If you want to see what a traditional Indian town is like, you have to go to Old Delhi. You can't please everyone, but I mean, the response actually shows extraordinary how notions of Indianness had shifted, and also perceptions of places like Old Delhi, that what people were seeing of Old Delhi was not, as it were, the design principle that an architectural historian might see, but the surface that you encounter when you're going there. But the historians and the critics were persuaded that this project heralded a genuine Indian revival. If there was any note of doubt, it was only about the relevance of a Rajasthani model for Delhi. In subsequent projects, Rewal tackled this head-on. In place of the yellow reconstituted stone cladding which evoked Jaisalmer, he used red and buff panels to imitate the Dolpur sandstone that had been used by Lutyens and Baker, and before them by the Mughals, in such conspicuous Delhi landmarks as Humayun's tomb of the 1560s. So buildings such as, next, the Indian Institute of Immunology of 1983, and next, the Scope Office Complex, completed in 1989, attribute and affirm a two-tone colour coding for the city. The Scope Complex seems to proclaim its descent from Humayun's tomb, not just through its colour, but by its scale, its use of the octagon in planning, and the domed chhatris. When Lutyens, to go back to him for a moment, was exhorted to employ them, he protested, "Chhatris are stupid, useless things." But he did use them. And Rewal's repetition of the gesture established their place in the permanent lexicon of Delhi's architecture. Of the very many projects that Rewal has completed since then, both large and small in Delhi, and include also, of course, many abroad, I want to mention just one more because you're about to go and see it, his office for the World Bank in the Lodi Estate, next, of 1996. Sorry, that's another thing of the scope, showing the chhatris on the skyline, looking like the Red Fort. Next. This is Rewal's design for the World Bank just down the road in the Lodi Estate of 1996, because here, too, he's clearly turned to the city's Mughal architecture for inspiration, but this time on a very different scale. The articulation of the facades around the central courtyard and the detailing of their stonework with overhanging jorokas evoke less the grand imperial gesture of a mausoleum, more the domestic scale and intimacy of a haveli. Next. This is actually not this is in Delhi, but it's, of course, a Rajasthani haveli, just to give you an image of a haveli. So, by conclusion, I should say I don't pretend that what I've just given you is either a full or a balanced survey of post-independence architecture in Delhi. For balance, I would need much more detail, more time, and for that purpose, I would recommend the survey by John Lang, or the more recent one by Peter Scriver and Amit Srivastava. I focused on a small selection of architects of a senior generation. You'd tell a very different story, I think, about different design preoccupations if one's focus was instead on younger, emerging practices, as indeed it is in excellent recent books by Jagan Shah and by Rahul Khanna. We're going to see just now a design by Stéphane Pommier, for example. I made my particular selection for a purpose, which I should now explain. Conservative designers and theorists like Leon Krier tell us that modern architecture homogenizes. It makes everywhere look the same. It's a very familiar complaint. You can't tell by looking at most modern buildings whether they're in Delhi, Chicago, or Kuala Lumpur. They forget, of course, that the neoclassical architecture of the 18th and the 19th centuries that people like Leon Krier so much admire was also an international style. If I showed you a neoclassical building, an image of a neoclassical building out of context, you wouldn't know whether it was Dublin or Potsdam. But they do have a point. Most people feel that rapid urbanization and the use of modern forms tends to deprive historic cities of their individual character. So, it's interesting to observe that at various times in the course of the last 70 years, some architects working in Delhi have paused to think about the character of the city and have striven to furnish it with buildings which represent and respect that character and which measure up in quality to its great historic monuments. So I think we should recognize and celebrate a measure of success in their endeavors, which ensure that there is indeed, and this is my concluding point, there is a modern chapter in the story of Delhi as a heritage city. Thanks so much for your attention.